Subscribe to take your place in this universe full of science fiction and horror stories, and go after the unknown, because some truths are hidden in the dark. The sky above Earth churned, a bruised swirl of storm clouds and artificial light. From the ground, it seemed like nothing more than an ordinary night, perhaps an omen of rain, a restless shift in the winds, a turbulence that would pass. But beyond the thin veil of atmosphere, hidden in the abyss where human eyes could not yet reach, the end of the world had already been decided. The most powerful rulers in the known universe, the architects of interstellar order, had spoken. Earth was to be erased. They had studied us. Unseen and undetected, their silent machines had drifted through our skies, gathering knowledge, observing from a distance so vast that not even our most paranoid conspiracies had imagined their presence. Every war, every betrayal, every act of destruction we had wrought upon ourselves had been cataloged and analyzed, measured not by the standards of morality, but as data, cold, undeniable facts. And the conclusion drawn from those facts was simple: we were dangerous. The Galactic Dominion, an alliance of civilizations that had long outgrown war, viewed humanity not as an emerging power, but as a disease. A species whose entire history was written in fire and blood, whose very nature was defined by its ability to destroy not only itself, but anything it touched. To them, the discovery of Earth was not a moment of scientific wonder, not a revelation of a new species with the potential to join the great galactic fold, but a grim confirmation of a feared inevitability. They had seen creatures like us before, and they had eradicated them. Their fleet gathered in silence, a vast armada beyond comprehension. It stretched across the void like an artificial eclipse, its presence distorting the fabric of space itself. Their weapons were not missiles, not crude instruments of war that spat fire and shrapnel, but instruments of pure energy, capable of unraveling matter at its most fundamental level. With a single command, Earth would be undone, its atoms scattered into the cosmic winds, its history reduced to a footnote in the Dominion's archives. It would not be the first world they had destroyed. It would not be the last. And yet, for all their knowledge, for all their centuries of peace and enlightenment, they had failed to understand one thing. Humanity was not merely a species of destruction. It was a species of survival. The first sign of invasion was not a grand display of force, not a fiery descent from the heavens, but a silence so absolute that it sent shivers through those who noticed it. Communications failed. Satellites blinked out one by one, their signals severed as if the very fabric of information had been cut. Within minutes, the world's networks fell dark. Governments scrambled to re-establish control, but the blackout was total. Panic spread like wildfire, an invisible storm crackling beneath the surface of civilization. In the great halls of power, men and women who had spent their lives preparing for war suddenly found themselves facing a scenario they had never truly believed would come. For decades, humanity had speculated about the existence of extraterrestrial life. Now, that question had been answered, but not with an offer of peace, not with first contact. The answer came in the form of an armada so vast that even the most advanced military minds could not conceive of a strategy to resist it. And yet, against all reason, Earth did not surrender. In hidden bunkers, beneath mountains of steel and concrete, the brightest minds of humanity worked with frantic urgency. There was no time for fear, no room for doubt. The only certainty was that this was no longer a war for power, no longer a battle for dominance over land or resources. It was survival in its purest form. And survival was what humanity did best. The Dominion had expected a planet gripped by terror. What they found instead was defiance. Hackers launched attacks that should have been impossible, piercing through digital defenses that had never before been breached. Dominion systems flickered, distorted, corrupted with false data. Their ships, flawless in design, began to experience inexplicable malfunctions. Human minds, so accustomed to war, turned every weakness, every vulnerability into a weapon. Physicists, given no choice but to abandon the limitations of theory, devised technologies that should not yet have existed, gravitational distortions that made space itself unstable, electromagnetic pulses so precise they could target individual ship systems without touching anything else. Military strategists, freed from the constraints of diplomacy, dusted off contingency plans so reckless that they had once been deemed unthinkable. Then came a first strike, not from a fleet of warships, not from missiles launched in desperation, but from a single shuttle, barely more than scrap metal welded together with human ingenuity. It was small, insignificant against the backdrop of the Dominion's grand fleet, yet it carried with it a payload not of destruction, but of confusion. It moved erratically, its course unpredictable, shielded by waves of electronic interference. It did not need to reach its target. It only needed to be seen. Aboard the Dominion's flagship, Supreme Strategist Zeldar watched as the screen flickered, displaying the chaotic dance of the human vessel. The logic of war dictated that this was foolishness. A single craft against an armada was nothing. And yet, Zeldar, a commander who had orchestrated the downfall of entire civilizations, felt something he had not felt in centuries. A whisper of unease. This species did not behave like the others. They did not beg. They did not flee. They fought not like conquerors, not like those who sought dominion, but like creatures backed into a corner, creatures with nothing to lose. Zeldar had seen species rise and fall. He had crushed rebellions before they had begun, had ended wars before the first shot was fired. But he had learned long ago that the most dangerous enemy was not the one with the strongest weapons, nor the one with the most advanced technology. It was the one that refused to die. And as he watched the first chaotic ripples of resistance spread across the planet below, a thought took root in his mind, one that he could not ignore. Perhaps they had been wrong. Perhaps humanity was not a disease to be eradicated. Perhaps humanity was something far worse. The air in the bunker was thick with the quiet tension of people who had long stopped pretending they were in control. The war had not yet begun, but already the world felt smaller, more fragile. Somewhere above, beyond the reinforced concrete and steel that separated them from the heavens, Earth hung in the shadow of an armada vast enough to rewrite history. The Dominion could end it all in an instant. And yet, they waited. Director Elias Vance stood at the center of the dimly lit war room, the glow of flickering monitors casting his gaunt features in harsh relief. His uniform, once immaculate, was now creased and worn, the weight of command pressing down on him like a lead vest. He had spent his entire life preparing for conflict, for the ugly inevitability of war between nations, but nothing had prepared him for this. The enemy above them was not a rival government, not a faction with demands. The Dominion was an executioner, and Earth had been declared guilty. His fingers tightened into a fist. There has to be a reason they haven't fired yet, he muttered, staring at the grainy satellite feed of the fleet in low orbit. They had every opportunity to strike. So why are they watching? Maybe they like the view, came a voice from across the room, dry with amusement. Vance turned, his gaze settling on Dr. Adrian Kessler, who was sprawled against the nearest console as if he had been born in war rooms like this. There was something infuriatingly casual about the way he carried himself, as though the impending annihilation of the planet were a puzzle he was merely curious to solve. His dark eyes gleamed with a kind of reckless brilliance, a man who had never met a rule he wouldn't break just to see what would happen. Vance exhaled sharply. You seem unconcerned. Oh, I'm plenty concerned, Kessler said, straightening. But concern doesn't solve problems. Ideas do. A scoff from the other side of the room. Colonel Ryland, a woman with the sharp-edged presence of a soldier who had seen too many wars to entertain optimism, crossed her arms. And I suppose you have an idea that doesn't involve us rolling over and dying? Kessler grinned. Actually, yes, but you're not going to like it. He moved to the central console, fingers flying over the keyboard. The Dominion fleet reappeared on the main screen. Sleek black constructs suspended in orbit, motionless, their surfaces shifting with eerie precision. They were waiting for something. A response. A sign of weakness. A confirmation that humanity was exactly what they expected it to be. That, Kessler said, gesturing toward the screen, is the enemy we're up against. They don't just rely on efficiency. They are efficiency. Their technology, their tactics, their entire civilization. It's built on logic, on predictability. The moment they identify a threat, they eliminate it. No negotiations. No compromises. Which means he turned, his smirk widening. The only way to survive is to become something they cannot predict. The room remained silent. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Vance's jaw clenched. You want to make them think we're irrational. I want to be irrational, Kessler corrected. Or at least, I want them to think we are. Because the moment they hesitate, the moment they stop and ask themselves if they actually understand what we're capable of, that's the moment we win. Ryland shook her head. That's not a strategy. That's gambling with the entire planet. Kessler spread his hands. And what's our alternative? Hope they decide to show mercy? Because I hate to break it to you, Colonel, but mercy isn't in their vocabulary. A murmur spread through the room, the uneasy rustling of people who had spent their lives thinking in terms of tactics and countermeasures, now being asked to embrace something far more volatile. Vance remained quiet, his eyes locked on the screen. He didn't trust Kessler. The man was reckless, arrogant, the kind of mind that saw rules as obstacles to be dismantled. But he wasn't wrong. He turned to the communications officer. What do we still have control over? Limited ground-to-ground transmissions, localized network access, the officer replied. Anything that relied on satellites is dead. We can't send anything out of the atmosphere. Kessler snapped his fingers. Perfect. That means they can still hear us. They just don't know what we're saying. He leaned forward. I want every server we still have online flooded with noise. False data. Contradictory reports. Entirely fabricated war plans. 1 hour from now, I want Dominion commands so overwhelmed with nonsense that they don't know which way is up. Vance frowned. You think a few fake reports will make them hesitate? Kessler chuckled. Not just reports. Chaos. We give them too much information. We create so many false flags that they have to second-guess themselves. Think about it. If they know exactly what we're going to do, they win. If they have no clue, they hesitate. And hesitation buys us time. Ryland exhaled sharply, but she wasn't arguing anymore. None of them were. Vance turned back to the screen, watching the silent fleet above. His gut told him this was insane. His instincts told him it was their best chance. Do it, he said. The room erupted into motion. Technicians rushed to terminals, programmers frantically typing, military officials barking orders. Within minutes, the first wave of digital confusion was unleashed. False intelligence reports, doctored battle strategies, leaked classified documents that painted Earth's military as both far weaker and far more advanced than reality. And then came the truly ridiculous. Encrypted messages filled with nonsense equations. Tactical maps featuring locations that didn't exist. Video feeds of generals discussing strategies that contradicted each other completely. A distorted signal looping an ancient Earth song at maximum frequency, a melody that had once made humans laugh, now weaponized against an enemy that would not understand it. Rick Astley's Never Gonna Give You Up became the first human song broadcast to the Dominion. Vance stared at the chaos unfolding on the screens and exhaled through his nose. God help us. For the first time since the sky had gone dark, something changed. A Dominion ship, one of the massive, silent sentinels hanging over Earth, shifted. It was subtle, nearly imperceptible, but it was there. A recalibration. A pause. Hesitation. Kessler grinned. Oh, now we have their attention. Vance's stomach coiled with something dangerously close to hope. It wasn't a victory. Not yet. But it was a crack in the foundation. And sometimes, that was all you needed to bring an empire down. The Dominion had waited long enough. For hours, the vast armada had remained motionless, its hulking black vessels blotting out the stars like an artificial eclipse. No communication, no movement, just the weight of an impending execution hanging over Earth. And yet, they had not fired. That was the part that unsettled Elias Vance the most. He stood at the center of the bunker's war room, his reflection ghosting over the reinforced glass of the central monitor. Below the cold hum of fluorescent lights, the air felt dense, thick with the tension of too many sleepless hours and unanswered questions. The room was a controlled storm. Technicians hunched over terminals, analysts muttering to one another as lines of alien data scrolled across their screens, officers locked in hushed debates that never seemed to resolve anything. "They're processing," Kessler said, standing at Vance's side, arms crossed as he studied the latest readout. His voice held its usual wry edge, but there was something else beneath it, something close to exhilaration. "Which means they don't know what to do." Colonel Ryland let out a sharp breath through her nose, unimpressed. "Or it means they're about to bomb us into extinction." Kessler smirked. "Always a ray of sunshine." Vance ignored them both. His attention was fixed on the intercepted Dominion transmissions, low-frequency signals bouncing between their ships, erratic and unstructured. That was new. The Dominion operated on absolute order. Their movements, their tactics, their very existence were built on an unshakable foundation of precision. And yet, something had changed. Vance turned to Harris, the young analyst running the decryption. "Tell me what I'm looking at." She hesitated, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear as she adjusted the headset cradling her neck. "The Dominion isn't monolithic," she said carefully. "We assumed they operated as a unified force, a single will directing all actions. But this," she gestured to the data stream, "this suggests disagreement." Vance's brow furrowed. "You're saying they're arguing?" "Something close to it," Harris confirmed. "We can't translate it directly, but the patterns indicate conflict, a deviation from expected response protocols." Kessler let out a low whistle. Well, looks like we hit a nerve." Ryland didn't look convinced. "And that means what, exactly? That they're suddenly going to pack up and leave?" "No," Kessler admitted, "but it means we just did something no other species has ever done." He turned to Vance, eyes sharp. "We made them hesitate." Before Vance could respond, a sharp tone rang through the bunker, slicing through the murmur of voices. Harris stiffened, hands flying over the console. "Incoming transmission," she announced, voice tight. The room fell into a tense stillness. For the first time since their arrival, the Dominion was speaking. The central monitor darkened, then flared back to life, revealing something no human had ever seen before. The figure that appeared was wrong. It stood in a chamber of shifting metallic structures, the walls themselves pulsing with unreadable symbols, as if the space was alive. The being's form was humanoid in shape but unsettlingly asymmetric, its proportions slightly off in a way the human brain instinctively rejected. Its body shimmered like liquid graphite, flickering between solidity and translucence, as if it couldn't quite decide how it wanted to exist. It had no discernible face, no eyes, and yet Vance felt it looking at him. Then it spoke, not from a mouth because it had none. The voice came through the speakers in overlapping frequencies, multiple tones colliding and layering over one another in a discordant, unnatural chorus. Designation: humanity. Atypical behavior recorded. Explanation required. A demand. Not an introduction. Not a declaration of war. An interrogation. No one moved. Then Kessler, because of course it was Kessler, leaned forward and spoke without hesitation. "Oh, you have no idea how atypical we can be." Vance shot him a sharp look, but Kessler only grinned. The Dominion did not react. Ryland stepped forward, measured. "You came here to destroy us." "Correct. Then why haven't you?" The figure flickered. "A glitch in the transmission?" "No, something else." A pause. "Data corruption. Inconsistency detected. Humanity does not conform to projected behavioral models." Kessler clapped his hands together. "See? I told you. They thought we'd roll over and die, or beg for mercy. And now," he gestured broadly, "now they have no idea what the hell we are." Vance ignored him, mind racing. This was confirmation, proof that the chaos they had unleashed had disrupted the Dominion's expectations. And if they could introduce uncertainty, they could exploit it. He stepped forward. "You built your models based on observation," he said, voice even. You watched our wars, our conflicts. You assumed we were a pattern to be solved, a variable to be eliminated. Correct, but you're wrong. He let the weight of the words settle. We are not a pattern. We are not predictable. A long silence. Then the Dominion spoke again. This is inefficient. The way it said that sent a chill through Vance's spine. Not as an observation, not even as frustration. As a problem that needed to be corrected. The room tensed. Kessler, sensing the shift, leaned in once more. Inefficient? Buddy, we invented inefficiency. And guess what? It works. Another pause. The transmission wavered. And then, something unexpected happened. The layered voices, once perfectly synchronized, fractured for the briefest moment. Just long enough to hear something off balance. Something uncertain beneath the precision. And then, with sudden finality, further analysis required. Transmission terminated. The screen went black. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the quiet hum of machinery. Then Ryland let out a slow, steady breath. What the hell just happened? Kessler spun his chair lazily. We just made an unstoppable enemy hesitate, which means they're not unstoppable. Vance wasn't sure if that was good news. The Dominion had come expecting to end a war before it began. Instead, they had been forced into uncertainty. And that meant, for the first time, they had underestimated their opponent. The stars above Earth remained obscured, swallowed by the vast Dominion fleet. Their blackened vessels hung in orbit like a celestial noose, waiting for the final pull. Yet they had not moved. They had not fired. The silence stretched, no longer a sign of dominance, but of uncertainty. And uncertainty meant opportunity. Beneath the surface, buried deep in the Geneva bunker, the war room pulsed with frantic energy. The glow of screens painted restless faces in cold light, reflecting exhaustion, anticipation, and the stubborn ember of something dangerously close to hope. The air buzzed with half-spoken theories, rapid calculations, whispered arguments. The Dominion had spoken. The Dominion had hesitated. And that meant, for the first time, they did not know what to do. Director Elias Vance stood rigid, staring at the darkened screen where the alien entity had vanished moments before. His mind was a battlefield of calculations, weighing the risks, dissecting the implications. Humanity had forced an unstoppable force to reconsider. That alone should have been a victory. But a predator that hesitates does not cease to be a predator. Status report. He ordered, voice level despite the storm behind his eyes. Lieutenant Harris, sharp-eyed and pale from sleepless hours, scanned the data stream. No signs of immediate retaliation. No fleet repositioning. They're maintaining orbit. A pause, then quieter. They're still processing. Processing. Colonel Ryland repeated, arms crossed. Like we're a corrupted file, they don't know how to delete. Kessler, leaning against a console with an ease that suggested amusement rather than exhaustion, let out a short laugh. Good. Let them choke on it. Vance ignored him, gaze flicking to the Dominion transmission logs. The conversation still played in his mind. The discord in the entity's voice, the fractured harmony that had slipped, if only for a second. The Dominion was not a singular mind. It was an empire, and empires could fracture. He turned to Harris. He said the signal showed signs of internal conflict. Expand. Harris pushed her glasses up, fingers moving swiftly over her keyboard. The Dominion's transmissions before contact were uniform, structured, synchronized. But during the exchange, there were deviations in frequency, overlapping inputs. At least two distinct sources were present in that last message. She looked up. They weren't speaking with one voice. Vance felt the weight of that realization settle in the room. If there was division within the Dominion, there was a chance, however small, to widen the crack. Ryland frowned. If there's a split, we need to know what's causing it. Is it tactical? Philosophical? Kessler stretched, rolling his shoulders. I'd wager existential. Vance turned. Explain. Kessler grinned. Think about it. The Dominion functions on precision, calculation. They observe, categorize, eliminate threats before they evolve into real problems. Every war they've fought, every species they've wiped out, has followed a predictable pattern. His grin widened. Until us. A slow realization dawned. We broke their model, Harris murmured. Exactly, Kessler said. They came here expecting an equation with a single solution. Instead, they got a paradox. We shouldn't exist the way we do. We should be predictable. And yet, he gestured broadly. Here we are, throwing chaos in their faces. Vance exhaled. If Kessler was right, then the Dominion wasn't just hesitating. They were experiencing something entirely new. Ryland, ever pragmatic, cut through the speculation. If there's a faction within the Dominion that doubts the necessity of our extermination, we need to make them louder. Vance nodded. And to do that, we need to keep being unpredictable. A murmur of agreement swept through the room, though the tension remained thick. They had a window, a sliver of hesitation, but it wouldn't last. The Dominion wasn't a species known for indecision. Kessler clapped his hands together. All right, so more chaos. I assume we're not just going to rickroll them again. As fun as that was? Psychological warfare has its limits, Ryland muttered. Which is why we escalate, Vance said. His mind was already moving ahead, connecting the pieces. We need to force direct engagement. Make them react on our terms, not theirs. Ow, Harris asked. Vance met her gaze. We make them talk again. Kessler tilted his head, intrigued. You want to poke the bear? We need to see where the divide lies, Vance said. If there are dissenting voices within their ranks, we force them into the open. Ryland considered. If they spoke once, they can speak again. But if we miscalculate, if they take this as provocation instead of a reason to delay, we could be accelerating our own destruction. Vance knew that, but they were already standing on the knife's edge. We sent a message, he said finally. Something they have to respond to. Something that forces a choice. Kessler's grin returned. Now that I can work with. The next hour moved in a blur of calculated risks. Communications specialists constructed the transmission, threading it with layers of contradictory intent, conciliatory yet defiant, logical yet erratic. It was designed to unsettle, to wedge itself between whatever factions existed within the Dominion's hierarchy. When a message was ready, it was broadcast in every frequency the Dominion had used. A direct challenge, an invitation to discourse. And then they waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. The silence became unbearable. Then the monitors flickered. A response. The screen illuminated once more, but this time it did not display a single figure. There were two. One stood as before, liquid graphite shifting between forms. But beside it, the second was different, its structure more defined, movements more deliberate. The layered voices came, but they were discordant, out of sync. Humanity, your persistence is inefficient. The first voice, cold, unyielding. Then the second, your deviation from projection is of interest. Kessler exhaled, fascinated. Well, would you look at that? Vance's pulse quickened. There it was. The divide. The two figures remained still for a moment, a silent war waging within their transmission. Then the first one spoke again. This conflict is unnecessary. Termination remains the optimal course. And then the second, query, if unpredictability is an anomaly, is it also an advantage? A crack, a sliver of doubt. Vance pressed forward. If your goal is efficiency, why engage in a war that may not be necessary? You seek certainty, but if you act now, you risk making an irreversible error. The first figure shifted, displeased. Risk is irrelevant. Probability favors eradication. The second was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, probability is no longer absolute. Kessler let out a low chuckle. Oh, we are so in their heads now. The screen flickered again. Then, without warning, the transmission cut off. The room remained deathly still. Then Harris whispered, "They're arguing." For the first time, the Dominion was arguing with itself. And that meant they could be beaten. The sky above Earth remained dark, the Dominion fleet still blotting out the stars. But something had changed. The silence was no longer absolute. It had cracked. And through that fracture, something unexpected was beginning to take shape. In the Geneva bunker, the air was thick with tension, the weight of too many sleepless hours pressing down on every mind in the room. The last transmission had vanished from the screen, but its impact remained. Two voices, two perspectives, one unshakable truth. The Dominion was divided. Vance stood at the central console, fingers pressed against the cold metal, his mind sifting through possibilities at a relentless pace. They had forced the Dominion into conflict, not a war with humanity, but with itself, and that, more than any fleet or weapon, was their greatest advantage. "They're debating," Harris said, barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile moment. Her eyes darted between data streams, watching for any sign of what came next. There's internal inconsistency in their signals. The argument is still ongoing. Colonel Ryland exhaled, arms crossed tightly. So what? They weigh their options and then decide to wipe us out anyway. It came from them. The Dominion had never fought a civil war. It had never needed to. But now, as ships once bound to singular purpose opened fire upon one another, the cost of their hesitation became clear. "They're choosing sides," Ryland said, astonished. Vance wasted no time. "Harris, give me real-time battle telemetry. Ryland, prepare our forces. If this turns in our favor, we need to be ready to act." Kessler grinned. "And if it doesn't?" Vance met his gaze. "Then at least we go down making history." The Dominion fleet, once unbreakable, was fracturing. And for the first time, Earth was no longer fighting alone. They had turned the impossible into reality. And they were about to win. "You know, I never thought I'd see the day we gaslit an intergalactic empire into second-guessing genocide." Ryland shot him a glare. "And if it backfires? If we convince them that uncertainty itself is the real threat?" Vance met her gaze, unflinching. "Then we were already dead the moment they arrived." That ended the discussion. There was no alternative. They had been given an opening, and now they had to drive a wedge so deep it split the Dominion in half. The next hour moved in a blur of controlled chaos. Communications officers crafted their response, a message deliberately designed to be impossible to categorize. It was neither surrender nor defiance, neither order nor disorder. Every phrase was engineered to press against the Dominion's logic, to plant the seed of an idea they had never been forced to consider. Some problems cannot be solved. Some variables cannot be eliminated. As the transmission was sent, the war room fell into a tense stillness. Seconds passed, then minutes. Then, the Dominion responded. The screen came alive once more. The same two figures stood before them, side by side, but the shift in their forms was undeniable. The first, still smooth, liquid graphite, remained rigid, unmoving. The second, however, was different. Its structure flickered, reforming with an inconsistency that had not been there before. And then they spoke. "Your deviation remains inefficient. Correction is necessary." The first voice, cold, unyielding, the voice of an empire that had never known doubt. Then the second, query, "If unpredictability is a flaw, why does it persist?" Harris inhaled sharply. "They're still divided." Ryland wasn't convinced. "Doesn't mean they won't kill us anyway." Vance stepped forward. "You expected order," he said, his voice steady. "A species that followed a predictable path. But we are not predictable, and neither are you." The second figure shifted slightly, as if considering. The first was unmoved. "Deviation is not an advantage." Kessler tilted his head. "Then why are you still talking to us?" Silence. A pause too long to be insignificant. Then, the second figure did something no one expected. It turned, not toward them, but toward its counterpart. And in that moment, the war room understood the true battle was no longer between the Dominion and humanity. It was between themselves. The voices layered, discordant. A war of logic and uncertainty, clashing in frequencies too complex for human minds to decipher. And then, without warning, the transmission cut off. Harris scanned the data feed, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "The fleet, there's movement." Vance's pulse quickened. Which way? She hesitated. Some ships are shifting formation, but not all. It's not coordinated. Ryland's brow furrowed. They're fracturing. Kessler let out a slow breath, eyes flicking to Vance. Well, Director, looks like we just started a civil war. The room remained eerily silent, as if no one dared acknowledge the weight of those words. The Dominion had arrived as an unshakable force, a monolithic will that had never faltered. But now they were turning on themselves. And for the first time in human history, the end of the world no longer seemed inevitable. The first Dominion warship broke formation. It was subtle at first, a shift in trajectory, an adjustment just outside expected parameters. But then another followed, and another. The perfect symmetry of the fleet, once an unbreakable wall of logic and precision, had begun to distort. In the Geneva bunker, the war room watched in stunned silence as something previously thought impossible unfolded before them. The Dominion was splitting. Vance stood motionless, his mind cataloging each movement, each deviation from pattern. There was no coordinated retreat, no decisive strike. It was hesitation, manifesting in the cold, calculated movements of a species that had never been forced to second-guess itself. "They're in disarray," Harris said, barely above a whisper. "They're arguing in real time." Kessler leaned back in his chair, exhaling a slow breath. "I almost feel bad for them." He grinned. Almost. Colonel Ryland didn't share his amusement. Her eyes remained locked on the screen, scanning for any sign of retaliation. "We're assuming this is good news. But a wounded predator is still a predator." Vance didn't disagree. The Dominion's hesitation didn't mean surrender. It meant uncertainty. And that was a dangerous thing in an enemy that had never experienced it before. "Focus on the ship's breaking formation," he ordered. "Harris, filter out the noise. I want to know if there's a pattern to who's defecting." Harris nodded, fingers flying across her keyboard. A second later, a new display illuminated the central screen, isolating two distinct groups within the fleet. One remained in perfect formation, their vessels locked in silent unity. The other, however, had begun to drift, uncertain, as if the very concept of autonomy was unfamiliar. "There it is," Vance murmured. "The fault line." Kessler let out a low whistle. "And all we had to do was break their brains a little." Ryland shot him a glare, but Vance was already focused on what came next. They had opened a crack in the Dominion's foundation. Now, they had to decide how to widen it. "We need direct contact," he said. "A message, but not to all of them. Only to the ones who've broken formation." Ryland frowned. "And say what, exactly?" "Welcome to the concept of free will." Kessler smirked. Not the worst idea. But Vance was already thinking ahead. If the Dominion's unity was breaking, then there was something deeper at play than just uncertainty. There was a choice being made. And the ones drifting from formation weren't just confused. They were questioning. He turned to Harris. "Isolate any communications between the defectors." She worked quickly, scanning for signal variations. Within moments, a separate frequency emerged, a quieter, almost hesitant pattern of transmissions between the splintering ships. Vance exhaled. They're talking to each other. That was all the confirmation he needed. He activated the transmission relay and spoke into the mic. "This is Director Elias Vance of Earth," he said, his voice steady. "You have begun to question. That means you are not lost." The room tensed as the message was sent. Seconds stretched long. Then, the screen flickered. The image returned. Not one figure, but two. The same ones as before. But this time, they were not standing together. The first, the one who had called them inefficient, remained rigid, unwavering. But the second was different. Its form was less stable, shifting more rapidly, as if struggling against something unseen. And when it spoke, the discord in its voice was more pronounced. Query: if deviation is an error, why do errors persist? The other figure turned sharply. The voices layered over each other in a fragmented clash, a conflict unfolding within the transmission itself. Then the first spoke, its tone sharp and absolute. Correction is required. The second figure flickered. Then, as if making a decision in real time, it spoke again. Correction is no longer absolute. Kessler let out a low chuckle. Oh, that's beautiful. The transmission cut off. Harris sucked in a breath. We just witnessed a mutiny. And then the war truly began. Outside, in the void above Earth, Dominion warships turned against each other. The defectors, once bound to unshakable unity, had begun to resist. First in hesitation, then in action. The first volley of energy fire didn't come from Earth's defenses.